Welcome to the Green Parking Council webinar, Sustainability, Risk, and Resilience, Perspectives from the Insurance and Engineering Industries. This webinar is part of our continuing series of online educational sessions on parking sustainability. I am Trevor Mead, Green Parking Council Program Manager. If you encounter any technical problems during the presentation, please email me at trevor@greenparkingcouncil.org or send a chat message in the box on the left-hand side of your screen. Please enter any questions into the chat box as well. We will have 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to go through the questions we received during the presentation. The session will run no longer than 1 hour. We'll begin today's presentation with an introduction from Green Parking Council Executive Director Paul Wessel, and then transition to brief presentations from each of today's panelists. We will conclude the session with a set of questions we've developed for our presenters. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Paul.
Thanks, and thank you everyone for joining us. What this is about today is that climate change is a sort of vague, amorphous worry for many of us, but it's probably down below on our list, thinking about things like cleaning out our closets, saving for retirement, or scheduling our colonoscopy. For some of us at least, that's an issue that we have to worry about. And as climate change occurs, for some of us it'll be fun, like surfing in parking garages, like in the picture you see on your screen. But for most of us, 100-year storms, wide temperature fluctuations, and rising water levels are going to be far more troubling. And if you're in the business of designing and building structures and infrastructure that are supposed to last for 50 years or more, or your business is insuring those kind of projects, climate change is a very real risk that your business requires you to assess and to quantify. So Gary Lawrence, who's one of our presenters, who's most recently been at AECOM, used to have scores of engineers with slide rules and calculators figuring out and assessing this risk. Jay Brunz, our other presenter, who's at the Hartford, a business which has been successful for over 2 centuries at assessing risk, he has legions of actuaries. And actuaries are like data samurai, and they take all these tests and they move up the ranks. I was working with somebody whose husband was an actuary, so I learned about this. Those actuaries are very skilled at helping insurance companies figure out and assess risk. So we wanted them today to share with us how businesses that operate where this kind of risk is fundamental to its functioning, how they do it, and what lessons we can learn from them. So Trevor, can you make the formal introductions of our presenters?
Sure, thanks, Paul. Today's first presenter is Jay Brunz. Jay is environmental champion at the Hartford. With more than 200 years of expertise, the Hartford is a leader in property and casualty insurance, group benefits, and mutual funds. The company is widely recognized for its service excellence, sustainability practices, trust, and integrity. Mr. Brunz guides the company's environmental stewardship efforts, which include reducing greenhouse gas emissions and paper use, offering green insurance products, and engaging the federal and state government as well as the company's employees. The Hartford has reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by more than 50% since 2007 and its paper use by 80% since 2009. Prior to joining the Hartford, Mr. Brunz served 25 years as a career American diplomat, rising to the senior foreign service. His postings included acting ambassador to Norway during 9/11, U.S. Special Negotiator for Conflict Diamonds, and in the White House as Director for International Economic Affairs in the National Security Council. Jay?
Thank you very much, Trevor, and thanks to those who are listening. As it was stated, I work for this very old, by U.S. standards anyway, insurance company, and that gives the company quite a nice backward-looking kind of view on how to remain sustainable. You know, we've had our ups and downs over those 205 years, but in the meantime, we paid out claims in the Great Chicago Fire, in the San Francisco earthquake, and of course during 9/11 we insured Abraham Lincoln's farm in Illinois, and we insured Babe Ruth while he was playing baseball. So our history is in some ways tied to the history of the United States, and we see a bright future and see a bright future for our country as well. I should say first, I'm very sorry that I've violated the cardinal rule on slide presentations, and you'll see a lot of wording. But I will kind of skip through some of it rather quickly. I'm going to spend up to 10 minutes to talk about the Hartford, and then look forward to adding in the discussion later. So for the first slide, the question becomes, well, why is it that a company like the Hartford would be involved with environmental stewardship, other than a kind of a why doing the right thing? Well, we see business reasons for doing this. One, we know that there is a strong correlation between recruitment and retention of employees and companies that do focus on corporate social responsibility issues, especially or including environmental stewardship. Also, our shareholders care that we are involved. In fact, it was shareholder proposals that prompted some of our participation, including in the Carbon Disclosure Project, issuing a climate change statement, and our annual sustainability reports. Also, we are regulated by each of the 50 states, and 6 state insurance commissioners require that insurance companies operating in their state who sell a certain amount of insurance have to describe what their response is to climate change. So we've been doing that, I think, for 4 years. And finally, some of our potential customers require or are asking in their RFPs what we were doing on the environment. That's in particular municipal governments and some very large national companies whose names you would know ask this in their RFPs. Okay, on the next slide. So I would argue that the Hartford and much of the insurance industry, I think, is kind of a good steward of the environment. Anyway, we as an industry, we reward prudent behavior, and we kind of penalize risky behavior. We really began to be intentional stewards of the environment, I would say, in 2007 when we joined Carbon Disclosure Project, a nonprofit in the UK whose mission it is to get the world's largest companies to report on and voluntarily reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. We issued a climate change statement in that year, and we created an environment committee. This environment committee internally is a very good bureaucratic mechanism for us to keep our initiatives on track and underway and make sure that they get completed. It is chaired by our general counsel, who sits in our C-suite and has one other C-suite member on it. As you can see, it's got a pretty high level of representation, including the managers or the people who are involved with managing our $200 billion of investments, as well as our enterprise risk management. So the next slide talks a little bit about this climate change statement that we issued. And one of the things that's clear in this and kind of everything we, and I would say generally the industry does, is we follow the science. And so we're very interested in the science on climate change, and for us, it's a pretty clear consensus that it is real and it's of increasing concern. And frankly, we see that anyway in some manifestations of our loss costs over time. And so we feel the need as an insurer, investor, employer, property owner, and responsible corporate citizen to do things, and our commitment is manifested in doing what I suggested we do, is reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, encourage others to do likewise, develop products to help our customers reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, make investment decisions on that score, and do more on land use planning. Next slide. So the Hartford has set now 3 voluntary greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We met the first 2, and we're in the middle of the 3rd. Lots of ways that we find to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. One key one is to help to encourage our employees, at least some group of our employees, to work remotely. Insurance is not a very large emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the first place. And we found when we were first looking at this that 1/3 of our emissions were our employees driving to and from work. So if they stay home and do the work from home, that obviates the need for those greenhouse gas emissions to go into the air, as well as obviates the need for some real estate footprint. And as this slide suggests, there are a number of other things that we do. Next slide. I've talked a little bit about this. We've got a range of products that help our customers go green. We have a renewable energy insurance practice, and their job is to try to sell insurance to the very strongly growing renewable energy industry, including wind farms and solar arrays. And we're doing pretty well on that score, starting kind of from a smaller base. We also, as it suggests, we've reduced our paper quite a bit in a number of ways, and we're saving ourselves about $9 million a year in doing that. Next slide. Well, just a number of other things that we do, including, as you can see, we're members of the Department of Energy's Workplace Charging Station Challenge. We have EV charging stations on our campuses. We're putting them in a new garage that we're just building now. As well, we're adding to our stock of charging stations. And we're also members of the DOE's Better Buildings Challenge. Next slide. We also encourage our employees to be engaged in this, and we've kind of handed it over to a volunteer group that calls themselves the Hartford Environmental Action Team. They've grown rather significantly over the last 5 years or so. They are the ones who kind of put on and stage the ways that we engage our employees. And they're also getting kind of increased recognition inside the company. So it's a kind of a win-win for us. Next slide. We've been also getting nice recognition externally, which helps us, that kind of reinforces for our leadership and our employees that we're kind of on the right track. And we've been on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index since 2012. We just learned recently that we're going to be on the Carbon Disclosure Leadership Index again this year, so that'll make it 8 years in a row. We won a couple of awards from U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on our management of our greenhouse gas emissions and a number of other areas of recognition. Next slide. So that's kind of an overall picture. I'll look forward to talking about how the Hartford looks at taking on the risks that we do and then managing them going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. Today's second presenter is Gary Lawrence. Gary is a consultant addressing sustainability, resilience, and food, water, energy, governance nexus issues in urban contexts. He was most recently associated with AECOM, a $20 billion provider of professional technical and management support services, where he was Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer from 2000 to 2015. Gary is a member of the Green Parking Council's Advisory Board. Prior to joining AECOM, Mr. Lawrence served as the Urban Strategies Leader at ARUP. Previously, he led Sustainable Strategies and Solutions, Inc., and served on the faculty of the University of Washington's College of Architecture and Urban Planning. He was also Planning Director for the City of Seattle, where he led the development of one of the world's first comprehensive plans dedicated to sustainability. His 20 years of global sustainability experience also include serving as U.S. Advisor to President Clinton's Administration Council on Sustainable Development, the U.S. government at the United Nations Habitat II, and the U.S. Agency for International Development. Gary?
Well, thank you very much, Trevor, and I've very much enjoyed this presentation so far. You'll see that I have a slightly different strategy, and I find that when I have words on slides, people hold me accountable for them, so I don't use very many. But I would like to talk to you about the issues associated with technology and risk associated with not only parking structures, but the role that parking structures play in whether cities and other places are successful in the midst of change. So the next slide, please. In my experience, there are 4 questions that have to be answered when we're thinking about, in this particular instance, how ought we design parking facilities? What role should they have in communities as part of the fabric of the community, in dealing with supply chain issues, and dealing with storage, in dealing with replacement reserves. So as many places get developed, the holding capacity of the land for water has been diminished, and so parking structures oftentimes play a substitute role for land. There are these 4 issues that are always part of the discussion. The first, and the one that I am probably most familiar with, is technical feasibility. And the feasibility of the structures has to do not only with their design and their placement and how they function in relationship to rising tides and sinking coasts and a variety of other things, but also there's a big aspect to this related to material science. There are companies, one I know of called Carbon Cure, has actually come up with processes to where in the batching and the making of concrete, they're able to pull all of the CO2 out of the cement and then place it back into the concrete as it cures. So there's net zero carbon cement, which is something we haven't heard of before and can now take advantage of. So it has to be technically feasible. It has to be economically viable. The owners and the managers of parking structures and their clients understand this clearly, that if it doesn't make economic sense, it's just not going to happen. There isn't, at the moment, going to be a lot of charity associated with the design and construction of parking structures. On the other hand, there also is going to be a lot more risk associated with where the structures are placed, how they're designed, and a variety of other things. So both the risk side, and we've talked about that with regard to insurance, and the supply side are both critical. And then the third element is political acceptance. So it has to be technically feasible, economically viable, and politically acceptable. And this is where I'm going to want to spend a little bit of time in the rest of the presentation, because there's 2 kinds of political that need to be incorporated into this. One is the big P political, the regulatory environments, what's expected of people designing structures, their placement, and other things. But there's also the small p political, which is the notion that elected officials, bureaucrats, have to actually see that the change is going to be accepted or they won't do it. So much of what we have talked about at the Green Parking Council in terms of thinking of parking structures not as places to store automobiles, but as community assets that have multiple uses, whether it's on the weekends using the rooftops and other areas for recreation, for neighborhoods, to creating storage capacity for flooding. So there's a place for food and medicine and perishables to be stored. All of that gets rolled up into the political conversation about whether the neighborhood actually is going to allow you to get a permit to build a parking structure when if you don't create the story correctly, they will be perceived just as not as assets but as blight. So those 3 elements all have to happen in a larger context, and that's the context of humility. Because we're dealing with probabilities, we're not dealing with any certainties here. And while many people have really want to pursue inappropriate certainty, it's not good for us with regard to actually getting the small p political acceptance for change. Next slide, please. So the framing question, and this sounds philosophical, I know, but it actually is relevant to what we are talking about, is, first of all, who are we today? Most communities don't really understand who they are. They understand attributes of the community, but we also tell ourselves a lot of lies about who we are. And then the question, even harder question, is who is it that we're trying to become? In urban places and suburban places that are still auto-oriented, what we're trying to become in terms of urban centers and what qualities of life we're trying to create actually is crystal clear to almost no one because we can't, the future hasn't been invented. So figuring out how, another design question, engineering question for parking structures, how do you design for adaptation so that as we get more clear on what we're trying to become, we can engage in that. And then the hardest question that I ever ask my clients is, given what you're trying to become and where you're starting from, what has to be different 2, 5, and 10 years from now if we're going to achieve it? And the Green Parking Council has been working with a number of people around the world on those issues associated with parking. Next slide, please. So I was thinking about this a couple of weeks ago. I was invited to give a presentation at a meeting called Eye on the Earth, which was held in Abu Dhabi, and it was about the role of big data in actually defining the needs to change. My role, I was required by, or not required, but asked by the government of Abu Dhabi to be sort of the thorn in the side, which is Paul and others with the Parking Council know is a role that I relish sometimes. And the question I was asking is, what is the relationship between big data and big wisdom? And how do you get from data and make sure the data you're considering is actually relevant to the attribute of the problem you're trying to solve, and convert that into information that has both emotional content as well as intellectual content, so it turns into knowledge that people want to possess and creates understanding so that they will then put pressure on their political systems, their economic systems, and others to create better outcomes for the future. This is an area where we have a lot of difficulty in the engineering community, in the planning community, and elsewhere, is this process of the relationship between information, data, information, meaning, and action, because it's crystal clear from all of the psychological literature is that except in times of war or natural disaster, people will not change their behaviors based upon somebody else's definition of meaning. The people who have to make the change have to make that definition themselves. So next slide, please. So this data, information, meaning, action, and feedback loops. I think this is an interesting plot. This is a radial plot visualization of all the Instagram photos that were filed, taken over a 24-hour period in Brooklyn following Superstorm Sandy. Now, I don't live in Brooklyn, but I live in New York, and so this is really relevant to me because I'm one of those that had to be evacuated from downtown when the superstorm came in. This is the kind of data that can be converted to information because you can see where the clusters are, where people actually putting most attention to the meaning of the storm for their lives at the lower end of this. And as you move away from the waterfront down on the East River and the bay, then the density of concern starts to diminish. And I have to say that living in New York, the density of concern has started to diminish. Part of the city government is working diligently on keeping the changes happening so that the city will be more resilient in the future. Some others have just sort of forgotten about it as though it was an anomaly that we shouldn't be concerned about. Next slide, please. So this is something that I keep with me all the time. Ask the experienced rather than the learned. Both have to be engaged in this conversation, but the learned more often than not think about the kinds of issues that the parking industry has to take on as abstractions as opposed to real things that have to be taken into account in ways that are technically feasible, economically viable, and politically acceptable. And going back, all of the changes actually have to be designed for adaptation. So with that, I will end, and hopefully we can have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. We'll now dive into a few questions we have for you and Jay. Gary, given that engineering, planning, and design firms have to look out 25, 50, or 100 years in their work, what is their assessment of the risks presented by climate change?
Well, the risk of the language is an interesting attribute of this discussion. Risk and resilience are the terms that are used more, and we have tended to frame the concern in terms of resilience and abandon most of the conversations about mitigation. And we also haven't talked very much about, okay, what do we learn when an event takes place that allows us to actually make better adaptations for the future so we don't face those kinds of risk and harm in the future. There is a lot of activity that's taking place, but for instance, in California, the drought in California, most of the citizens of California think that the drought is a direct function of climate change. Most of the atmospheric scientists say, well, no, it's part of a normal cycle. But the difference is that climate change has created such heat that the low amount of water actually is evaporating more rapidly. And that's why the water problem exists. It's not a direct function of climate change. It's a byproduct. So that's when I was trying to get to the question of what is knowable and what is the probable versus the actual, and understanding attributes versus the whole system problem. We are seeing around the world that there are behaviors that you would not expect given the risks that you read about with regard to climate. And I would say the best example of that in the United States is Miami and Miami Beach, where the highest point in Dade County is 12 feet above sea level, It's built on limestone. So as sea level rises, it increases the pressure through the limestone, and you end up having both a lifting motion as the water actually acts like hydraulic pumps coming up through the limestone, as well as pushing motion associated with a change. They're still building those, and they're still insuring those, and that's the kind of thing where an engineer can say, yeah, we can actually make this a responsible action for the next 20 years. But if you're looking for something with a 100-year life, this makes no sense at all.
Thanks, Gary. Jay, what is the Hartford's assessment of the risks presented by climate change?
Right. Well, I would just want to explain a little bit. When you think of an insurance company and risk, think of an insurance company as a very large risk manager, right? We have a huge internal effort to try to assess the risk and make sure that when we decide to keep a risk that we're going to insure, that rather than say lay it off to a reinsurer, that we understand that risk and that we can match price to risk, so that we can charge the appropriate amount to make sure that we take on that risk as a risk transfer mechanism from the person who wants to buy the insurance, and that we at the end of the day have a small profit. So we have an army of people internally to help us do that, as well as we use the large risk modeling firms like RMS, AIR, and Equicat, and then we tweak them sometimes internally using our own risk modelers to figure out what we think are the probabilities of various types of risk. And think of climate change as one of many risks that we look at. We're clearly in the past and in the present and on into the future, companies like the Hartford worry about the risks posed by asbestos, is still living with that legacy. Think about, we offer a lot of cyber risk insurance. We faced a great deal of financial risk during the financial crisis. So climate change is one of many. It manifests itself for us mostly with the notion of more frequent and more severe weather events. And as you know, the climate science suggests that that's going to happen. It doesn't give us anything like, well, what year it's going to happen, where it's going to happen, how much it's going to happen, and so we have to be nimble and kind of figure that out. We have seen in the data, for example, the field of what I would say the hail zone, the most extreme hail zone inside the continental United States. Our data, our loss cost suggests that field has grown. So the communities that are suffering from greater hail damage and more severe hail damages, if you're going to draw a ring around the geography, that geography has gotten larger. So for us, it's the risk of severe weather events that we've been dealing with throughout our history, but the uncertainty is an issue that we're going to have to deal with probably more in the future.
Trevor, can I just say one short thing about a different kind of risk? For the industry, one of the risks is not taking advantage of the opportunities presented by climate change. One of the major problems in most urban centers is that the land values are such that nobody can afford to keep inventory, refrigerated inventory for perishable goods, medicines, all that sort of stuff. The relationship between parking structures and thinking themselves as part of the supply chain for resilience in the face of climate and those sorts of things, and maybe some big business opportunities there.
Thanks, Gary and Jay. So, Jay, how does the Hartford plan for the risks associated with climate change, and what steps can you, your clients, and customers take to prepare for and mitigate the risks of climate change?
Right. Well, as I suggest, we kind of overlay our own experience, and the advantage of insurers is you get the loss costs of not only your own losses, but through the insurance mechanism. The way it manifests itself in the United States is you have access to a broad array of insured losses, loss costs from all the insurers who participate. And then you decide what your appetite is and where you see opportunities and where you're trying to grow. So as Gary mentioned, opportunities as well as downside risks, and certainly we see opportunities in doing things like trying to capture more of the renewable energy infrastructure that's being built, and to offer insurance to those projects. And we're, like I say, we're doing reasonably well on that. When it comes to our clients and customers, I mean, we have our end customers, the ones who buy our insurance, and we take the learnings that we ourselves have learned after an event, and try to internalize those and help our customers with those. For example, in the wake of Superstorm Sandy, we did a study of small businesses. Small business is a key, a strong area of the Hartford's business, and we interviewed, I think, 450 small businesses that were affected by Storm Sandy, and learned some very interesting things. And then, for example, I think it was something like 70% of all the companies interviewed lost revenue, but only 11% suffered physical damage. So clearly, there was a pretty large percentage of companies that had problems with their data because they had not backed up their data. So it's a simple thing like, are you making sure that if you're a very small business that you have your data stored somewhere else other than just on site, because you may not be able to get back to that site for a few days. So we had those learnings. We've taken them internally and used them internally, and we've had our leaders go out for to try to market to publicize the information we learned from this small business study. And we do that kind of thing pretty often. We just finished a middle market study, which was very interesting in that we were trying to encourage our customers and everybody to be more prepared and more resilient. So we asked business customers if they had a business continuity plan, and it was something like 65% or so said, yes, we have one. 58% I think said they had a written plan. Another 15 or 20% said they had an oral plan, but there was over 10%, as I recall, who had no plan at all. And for those who did have a plan, about 20% had ever actually practiced the plan. So clearly we think that you should have a plan, a written plan, and practice it. Like as a big company like ours, we're always undergoing some kind of practices, either with our IT systems or for fire, or for practicing a severe weather event that would keep us all at home, and those kinds of things, to make sure that we can continue, that we've got the business resiliency to continue operations even in the face of severe weather adversity. And we certainly want to help our customers do the same.
Thanks, Jay. Gary, what steps can you and your clients take to both prepare for and mitigate the risks of climate change?
Well, I think Jay presented laid out the whole inventory. With our clients, it's clients of engineering and design firms, that it starts sooner. It starts with, okay, what are the attributes of design? Where are you going to place your facility? How does it actually relate to energy supply systems, to IT, those sorts of things? What's been the experience with regard to flooding? And it even includes discussions about, okay, if recruitment and retention, which for most companies is one of the most important investments they make, are you actually locating in a place to where it's safe for your employees and their families to live, because they will make the choice to go and work for somewhere else if they don't perceive that. So, you start with the broader design, and then you start to drill down, okay, how do the facilities relate to one another? What are you doing in terms of being able to manage your own energy on site? What are you doing so that you can actually reduce water reuse, so that if regional water supply is affected in some way, you can continue to function. And another big part of this is discussion about, again, location and facilities, how it relates to where your customers are. When this wasn't directly a climatic, well, it was a climatic event, but it wasn't greenhouse gases, when the nuclear plant was reduced in capacity in Japan, they had to dramatically reduce the amount of power they were using in the country. And so certain factories had to get shut down. So a company on Long Island went out of business because the essential part they needed for their whatever they were making couldn't get from the factories of Japan to Long Island because it wasn't producible. So, it ends up being sort of this broad-based story. It's not just the facilities, and it's not just the roads and the rail systems and a variety of other things. It's the idea that sustainability and resilience are all about managing complexity. So what are the nexus of all the systems that are necessary for you to be successful, to serve your clients, and to keep your employees and their families safe in the midst of dramatic change. And you can design for that. Now, whether if the builder or the owner is, it's not going to be owner-occupied, then getting that included in the design brief is more difficult than it is if it's going to be owner-occupied. So, but the many cities are now starting to take into account that just as there can be no resilient communities without successful enterprise, companies are starting to figure out that there's no way for them to be resilient unless the city or wherever they're placed is resilient as well. So the discussions with the Carbon Disclosure Project and a variety of other things are now taking a different form, where both the public and the private sector are coming together and figuring out what do we need to do in concert in order to share the risk.
Thanks, Gary. The Urban Land Institute's magazine recently highlighted a Massachusetts garage being built as a universal structure, adaptable for conversion to denser, high-value uses like office or retail over time. The Proactive Solution File article argued typically sustainability is thought to apply to those issues related to materials, energy, and air quality. As such, it involves a one-time review that addresses design and construction. While longer-term commissioning is a goal, those issues are not economic. But for a long-term developer, sustainability can be viewed over an extended time horizon. When assets are owned for decades, investment decisions can take into account long-term factors like life cycle costs, adaptability, not just short-term returns on investment. Gary, what do you think of this approach to developing assets with a life of 50 years or more as we look to mitigate risk and develop with more resilience?
Well, I like it very much, and that's maybe just because I've been involved with that for a while. I'm not old enough to have designed 50 years ago, but I'm getting there. I worked on a project in North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany where this new urban quarter that was being developed around Dortmund, the city and the owner decided that parking structures would eventually become apartments. And so the city subsidized the parking developer and had them build with 12-foot ceilings as opposed to 8-foot ceilings, and then run the chases for conduit and that sort of stuff in the building as it went up. So as the residential density around the parking structure got greater, floor by floor, they would refit them as dwellings. And they also had the foundations such that they could actually build from the top down. It makes perfect sense if you're willing to actually take the risk that the money you have available has an opportunity cost, and you can apply that opportunity cost to these kinds of changes. There are great examples in the world that the library at I can't remember if it was Oxford or at Cambridge was designed with a 500-year life. And they found the plans in the attic, and all of the oak trees that had been planted around there had been planted for the specific purpose to be harvested and create new wood for the braces and those sorts of things in the building as the old wood would start to rot. This isn't a new idea. What's different about it is that our sense of time has changed. And we don't think about the future as being 40 or 50 years from now. We think about the future as being next year. And as a result, our willingness to invest in the future is less than it used to be. It's one of the big problems with resilience in Europe and North America is that most of the infrastructure is actually past its useful life. Previous generations built it, previous generations maintained it. We're now ignoring it, and we don't have the resources necessarily to build new and maintain old at the same time. That may be for cities in Europe and North America the biggest risk, climate risk of all, and that is that most cities are, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. They have enough operating capital, but they don't have replacement reserves for any of their infrastructure.
Thanks, Gary. Jay, what do you think about encouraging long-term projects to think more about resilience and risk in their design?
Well, personally, it certainly makes a lot of sense to me. I would say, a lot of people look at the insurance industry and say, well, the insurance industry doesn't really have a long-term perspective because you only write contracts generally for 1 year out. That is true, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to work with the same customer year after year after year. I mean, I expect most people have an experience where they probably have a pretty long-term relationship with their insurer. And then in addition, we understand the acquisition costs. to get a new customer. It's actually quite a bit. So retention of insureds that we have is a pretty high priority, and I think not just for us, but for everyone in the industry. So while the contracts are, to be sure, written generally for 1 year, doesn't mean that we only have a 1 year time horizon.
Thanks, Jay. The World Bank says the transport sector is essential to reducing poverty and building prosperity. Transport gives access to jobs, education, and healthcare. It connects goods and services to markets and is a key driver of growth. Finally, lowering the carbon footprint of the sector is crucial to tackling climate change. Jay, if this is accurate, how can the work of the Green Parking Council help us, in the Hartford's words, prepare, protect, and prevail?
Well, I think that the transport sector is indeed essential, and parking structures are very important, as you know better than I. And building them green makes a tremendous amount of sense. I think that the Hartford's kind of catchphrase, "Prepare, protect, and prevail," can be applied across a great number of areas, including to the Green Parking Council and its work.
Thank you, Jay. Gary, what's your advice to our partners and our board about how our businesses can best contribute to the future for our grandchildren and children as it relates to climate change?
Well, that's, of course, no simple question. The thing that I would think that the board and the advisory board and the members would need to do is start asking the question, so how does this relate to that? So I've mentioned a few things. How does parking actually relate to supply chains and the availability of necessary goods and services that would be cut off from neighborhoods or communities if an event had occurred? How do the parking structures actually relate to mobility and access? We've had discussions about how by using the flat roofs on the top of the structures as solar collectors, you can actually create rechargers for batteries, and the parking structures can actually be the center of the advance of the battery-powered vehicle, whatever scale you're talking about. And the difficulty, of course, there is we still don't have any idea how to dispose of the batteries in an environmentally responsible way. But the powering of them in the structures actually helps cities who don't have the land assets to actually create parking recharge areas. And you see in the news with some regularity and all sorts of interpersonal conflict over who actually gets to charge their vehicle when, including violence. So I think that the idea of parking, if you think that your business is parking, then you're going to limit the ideas that you bring to the table to make these assets more productive, more valuable to the community, and earn more for those people who are investing in them. So think about the relationship to medicine. Think about how most cities actually have been designed by men for men, and it makes it more difficult for older adults and single parents or parents with infants to get around, and how the parking structure might actually be part of the solution to that, how it relates to public transportation. There's a variety of things that you can add to the array once you move beyond and insist on moving beyond the notion that parking means a static place to store something.
Thanks, Gary. We have just a minute or two for questions, so I've got one question for each of you. The first is for you, Jay. We know that you charge less for insuring electric vehicles at the Hartford. How about for sites that are LEED or otherwise certified by different types of sustainability programs? Is that something that the Hartford has evaluated?
I'm not sure that our underwriters take into account. I think just generally our underwriters obviously look at the quality of the construction and all that. So I expect that the LEED certification may come into play for insuring commercial structures. But to be honest, I'm a little further away from that, so can't quite comment. But yeah, so I think I'll leave it there.
Okay. Thanks, Jay. And Gary, you had mentioned the project in Germany that the city had subsidized the ability for the project to include adaptable design. What do you think that we can do to make that more prevalent throughout the parking industry?
Well,
the
I
use
think
of
you
adaptable.
need to. I think you need to be speaking to the planning directors and the design directors and figuring out with them what kinds of densities, both commercial and residential, they're facing, and what kind of conflict they're facing as the parking industry is trying to meet the demand for the parking, and how you can join those things together so that you're talking about playing a role in the evolution of better neighborhoods or better communities, rather than just, again, seeing yourself as a place that makes money storing automobiles for certain amounts of time. Unless it affects the small p political that you're describing an attribute of a preferred future for the neighborhood as opposed to talking about optimizing your business, you're going to have a more difficult time, I think, winning hearts and minds.
Thanks, Gary. That's all the time we have for questions today. I want to thank both of our panelists. We're really grateful that they were able to take some time this afternoon and share their expertise with us. As of tomorrow, this presentation and our panelists' contact information will be available on the Green Parking Council website. If you have questions that we weren't able to answer today, I encourage you to reach out to both Gary or Jay. In addition, please email me with any suggestions you may have for future webinars at trevor@greenparkingcouncil.org. Thanks for joining us.